Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords. It's a bit of a windy night out there today and it's making the stand wobble. Because my window's open. But tonight, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Game of Thrones. Both the current version and the original version, which was also known as the War of the Roses. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of this argument I've been making on here and on all my social media about the difference between running an RPG as a history, where what you're doing is you're playing through live events, or as a story, where you're creating a story, you have an idea in your head of the story you're making, and you guide it along and you make something out of that. I have been saying time and time again, some of you have listened, some of you have not, about how D&D is not made for making story. It's for making history. So what is history? History is when you have a living world, and events happen in this world. They happen organically. They don't happen. There's no moment like, nobody said Gavrilo Princip is going to shoot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and start World War I because that's, of literary value to us, right? It's not because it's, that would make a good plot twist in the novel, right? It's just stuff that happened, right? And that's why crazy stuff happened, right? No one could have really, I think it would have been very hard for anyone to imagine until it happened that a single half-crazed, Balkan anarchist shooting an inbred crown prince of one state would create this cascade effect of starting a global war that would kill millions, right? It's the sort of thing that later becomes novels, because novels can only borrow from history, which is proof that they're inferior to history itself, that the real world is the greatest source of unbelievable things. And so nothing you can think of, as in to invent a story, is going to be as great. It might be more fantastical, it might have more, weird things or funny things or random things or whatever, but it's not going to be better than what actually happens in history. And that's where we get to, the story of Game of Thrones, because in the series we've just seen the finale, and I've taken a couple of days to post this, so it's not to cause any distress over spoilers or that. Probably not even going to mention any of the details, but there's been a vast consensus among most people who've been watching the show. There's some people who thought that the finale was great. There's not that many who thought it was great, but there are some. There's some more that thought it was okay but maybe disappointing, and there's some who thought it was awful, more than those who thought it was great. But generally speaking, I think almost all of those people, even people who thought that the finale was okay or maybe even good, will agree to the statement that the first several seasons of Game of Thrones were much better than the last ones, and that the last ones were getting progressively worse. And there's a reason for this. The first seasons were all based on the novels written by George R.R. Martin. George R.R. Martin did not write his novels as a novel. He wrote them as a chronicle, as a kind of a history. He wrote them in a way where he imagined a real world and real things that happened in it. And this is not a coincidence, because George R.R. Martin is a gamer. He plays tabletop games. He plays D&D, loves GURPS, stuff like that, right? All these different games. And we know that some of his novels were directly based on RPG campaigns he ran. And so, because he's played RPGs and because he's played them the right way, he doesn't play them in the form of, I'm going to create this plot and the plot is going to go this way. Instead, he creates this world, he creates all these characters, he creates certain trigger events, and then sees where the characters go with that. And that's how the story gets away with him, why it rambles so much, why he's had so much trouble finishing the series. Because he's not planning what happens. He's surmising it from creating a kind of virtual world in his own mind, right? A living world with living people who are making choices, and he's trying to figure out how those choices would end up happening. It's like you make a computer program and you create some little artificial life forms in there, And then they all have programs of what they're inclined to do, but then when they interact with each other, that might also change. And then you set them going, and then watch what happens. This is what I call the clockmaker God, right? In the era of the Enlightenment Christian philosophers, to try to make up for the fact that they no longer wanted to believe in a superstitious world, their concept of God couldn't be of this God that goes around directing every little thing, right? He's not the God that wins the football game, right? Their view of God was that God created the world and all these things in it, and he gave everyone free will, and that's a big part of this problem with the clockmaker God, right? That a God who gives you free will means that you have to be free to actually do things. So a God that keeps on interfering isn't giving you real free will. If everything that's going to happen is already decided, or even some of those things are decided, he hasn't really given you free will. So the argument, the theory of the clockmaker God is that God set everything together like a man building a clock, like building a mechanism, and then let it run by itself, right? And he's not actually interfering with how it runs. Well, that's how a DM should run a campaign. He should have a set of events. You know what's going to happen in a timeline, this and this and then this, but not in the sense of this is the plot of the story, but in the sense of these are events that are very likely or possibly likely or bound to take place. Depending, you could say, 5 years from now in the game world, there's going to be an earthquake. Okay, yeah, there's going to be an earthquake. Nothing will change that. Who might be there, who might live or die in the zone where the earthquake hits, that might change depending on what the player characters do. But it's very different that from saying, well, this is going to be a quest where they're going to fight the Orc King, then they're going to move over there. They obviously have to beat the Orc King because then they have to go and recover the Scepter of Justice. And then from there they have to take the Scepter of Justice to defeat the Undead Army, which they will also succeed at, because if not, I can't get them to the next place, which is where they become rulers of such and such domain, and then get caught up in this conflict with the Giantkin or something. And then you've already decided basically how everything has to go, because you're a writer writing a story instead of a person chronicling a history of events that are playing themselves out. The first 5 years or so of Game of Thrones, 4 or 5 years, was that. The parts that were directly based on the novels, one of the reasons they were so good was because they didn't act like novels. They weren't what we expected was going to happen. And some people thought, well, that's just because he's a really clever writer. No, it's because George R. R. Martin was a game master. And he isn't writing his book as a novel. He's writing it as a history. And so in his story, he doesn't have to be bound by the tropes. He directly becomes not limited by the tropes of the literary conventions, right? He doesn't need... Ned Stark doesn't have to be the guy that succeeds or that, overcomes great difficulty and then later does this or that. He might just be the guy who gets his head chopped off because he trusted the wrong dude, right? And Robb Stark, it doesn't necessarily have to end up being the guy who dies heroically in battle. He might end up making a mistake because he breaks a marriage oath and then ends up getting himself massacred because some other guy is not going to allow that slight to go unresponded, right? And they break all the rules of hospitality to do it. And in all of this stuff, George R. R. Martin is borrowing from elements of history. A vast amount of what's in Game of Thrones, of events that happen, and even the personalities of the people in it, are found in the War of the Roses, which is also the background of my Dark Albion, the Rose War setting. It's also the background of a whole series of the historical plays of William Shakespeare, which were really the first Game of Thrones, right? Like, William Shakespeare's historical plays were hugely popular for exactly the same reasons that Game of Thrones is popular with us, right? It's because they were a brilliantly crafted telling of a historical series of events that were also full of intrigue, murder, assassinations, betrayals, plots, etc. Right? All of the stuff that makes Game of Thrones awesome. I mean, there weren't actually dragons there, but there was even witchcraft and stuff going on in there, so it was good, right? In Dark Albion, the Rose War, I basically take the War of the Roses and add in some fantastical elements, but not a lot, but it's still basically playing out the events of the War of the Roses, including, conflicts between the different noble houses, the three sons who take a revenge oath after their fathers are slain, one of them that takes it too far and murders a boy. There's a snotty little kid who's the son of the queen, and he's an absolute torturous shithead, right? Like, Joffrey's there, Tyrion's around there, you see there's versions of everybody in there, right? There's versions of Loras Tyrell in there. You see Stannis Baratheon, all of them. They're all based on people and things. Cleverly altered, obviously, but they are basically all based on characters and events of the War of the Roses. The Red Wedding is not something that George R. R. Martin came up with himself. It was something that he drew from history, and he was able to do that by using these techniques of treating a living world as history rather than a story. And then, after his part was over, the other writers came in, and they were Hollywood writers that write like novels. They probably did really well in their English lit classes and creative writing classes in their lefty university, right? Where they teach them how to write to formula, and where they direct them to follow these rules on guidelines of novel crafting. There's better and worse novel making. We can debate whether, the end of Game of Thrones was mediocre, awful, or really awful, or even maybe kind of good. Hard to say, right? But what we can say for sure is that when you're writing a novel, it ends up being totally different. Here, all of a sudden, characters become predictable. One of the wonderful things about Game of Thrones is that unless you'd read the books, people who read the books obviously knew what was going to happen, but people who hadn't read the books and hadn't gotten spoilers, they were shocked. You see some of the reaction videos to something like the death of Ned Stark or the Red Wedding, and they're just blown away by it, right? You do not expect that. You don't see that coming, right? Because it's not something that follows. Your mind is trained already to pick up on literary tropes, right? Oh, there's this guy here, and he's kind of this sneering, courtier or something, and so you know that in the end he's going to betray this guy, and then this other thing is going to happen, right? And stuff like that, right? You're in your subconscious, you know all of these TV tropes, so to say, which aren't really TV tropes, they're literary tropes, right? They're things that you know how to expect, and therefore know how they should be resolved. And they're trying, the people who are making Game of Thrones at the end of Game of Thrones were trying to keep that unpredictability, but they couldn't do it by creating history because they don't know how to do that. So instead what they did is a novel with a lot of shocking twists, which is not the same thing, right? It's not the same thing that there's a sudden shocking twist in how Daenerys behaves, or in how Jaime acts, or Tyrion suddenly becomes retarded, or whatever happens, right? Like those things, or Bronn can somehow teleport to King's Landing, from King's Landing to Winterfell and back, right? Like none of those things are the same as having the unexpected events of a history. So they still feel different to us. They thought that would do it because they assumed that was how George R. R. Martin was doing, but it wasn't. So if you as a DM are creating stories that are full of unexpected twists and turns, well, good for you, but it's still a created story. It's not the same as playing in a living world. If you're if you want the Game of Thrones experience in your D&D or OSR world, you can certainly get a lot of that with using Lion and Dragon, an excellent system for running Game of Thrones. But with whatever system you're using, if you want to get that experience, you need to run your game as a living world. You as the DM are not in control of what the NPCs do. That sounds really weird, right? If you're used to the model that you've been taught wrong to do of running D&D like you're the writer of a novel or a TV show, right? You have to be able to give the NPCs so much life that you do not know or expect what they're going to do. And you need to give the world so much life that there'll be things that'll happen in the world that are going to be there, like you're going to get to such a place, and you don't know what was at such a place. Yeah, instead of trying to fill in the blanks of, okay, well, there's a castle in this place, instead, if you know the world, and the world is a living world, when you get there should be something there that you should figure out what it is without having to work it through in your head. And what an NPC, a well-fleshed out NPC, is going to do in reaction to something a player character does, shouldn't be something you'd have to think out in your head. It should be something that comes to you through the kind of spirit of that NPC. Right? The world should surprise you. Because I'm sure that it surprised George R. R. Martin. For starters, he thought that the series would be over a lot quicker, right? This is the secret of how to run a game that will feel like that. That'll give you that early Game of Thrones experience and not the late Game of Thrones experience. All right? That's how you have to do it. You make it a living world. You have the player characters free in their choices. You have a set of possible events and of definite events in the sense of things that are going to happen because of nature or stuff like that. Then you have a bunch of characters. You have NPCs, groups, bad guys, monsters, whatever. And instead of figuring out the whole story of what happens to them, just understand who they are and then let them move on the board by themselves. Let the board come alive without you being the one directing it. So you're not making a story. You're allowing history to take place. You're in a virtual world, not in the setting of a book or a TV show. All right? Because otherwise you're going to end up like HBO after Game of Thrones is done. Right? Their watch has ended. So I guess that's everything for today. And if you like this video, please subscribe if you haven't yet. Hit that notification bell so you get updates as to when I'm posting stuff. And share this video anywhere you want to. Sharing the video is one of the best ways you can help me out. We've already gotten well past 1,100 subscribers, which is great. Thank you so much to everyone who subscribed. The more subscribers we get, the better. If you want to support me, to help me continue to make more videos more often, to do better, to do more work, and or just give me some tips because you back my plays, then consider my games like Lion and Dragon and Dark Albion, which I guarantee if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you're going to like these games. Lion and Dragon is a game, Dark Albion is the setting, right? But if you don't want to spend that much money, check out my RPG Pundit Presents series. There's a link in the description. RPG Pundit Presents is a weekly PDF series of short source books, you could say, that have material for OSR style D&D play. They include, some of them are location settings, mini settings sort of stuff, like cities and what have you, monsters, adventures, alternate magic systems. We're up to, I think, issue 78 now. So, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there, and you're bound to find one that you like. Trying to remember what the current one is as of now. I think the last one that we did was the Grand Floating City of Lol, which is a gonzo setting, a crazy science fantasy world, a domed floating city that has techno walruses and wizards, and it's in the middle of a violent and bloody street-by-street civil war, and there's magic and there's technology, and it's a really, really good source book for setting a location that you can pop into your weird fantasy or gonzo game world. And then the one we've done this week, as of this showing, is a Medieval Authentic City Guide for Ipswich. So in the Dark Albion setting, it's basically set in England, right? And I've got all kinds of medieval authentic historical material on it. This source book is the first of well, there'll probably be quite a few, that will expand that into providing a detailed look at what some of the medieval cities of England were like around the time of the War of the Roses, including all kinds of details about the city, its neighborhood, its people, its organizations, its laws, its local customs, and then all the supernatural stuff, right? The local legends and myths, the local events, and all sorts of things for you to include an authentic medieval city, which you can, if you don't want to, if you're not playing in England, you could just kind of erase the name and put something else, right? But if you want a medieval authentic look and feel to your game world, this is a great guide to pick up with, random events and random tables for encounters and all kinds of stuff like that. So check that out. But if neither of those appeal to you, there's, 75 other issues that you can take a look at. If you want to help me out, they cost between 99 cents to $3.99 each. So check out as many as you like, pick them up, buy them all, buy the ones you like, buy whatever, and then you're sending me a little tip, which is a nicer way of doing it, I think, for you, because you get something out of it directly than just supporting me on PayPal or Patreon. Though if you really want to do either of those, I have those too, and you're more than welcome to donate a few $1,000s to the RPG Pundit Fund. Feel free. But again, more important than anything else, subscribe and share the video. Thank you guys so much. I'm not 100% sure yet if it's happening or not, but there's a very good chance that this Sunday there might be an issue of inappropriate characters. It'll either be this Sunday or 2 weeks from Sunday. We haven't been able to figure out the timetable yet. We're waiting to see whether Venger Satanis' wife gives him permission. But keep your eyes peeled if you're a fan of my Inappropriate Characters channel with Venger Satanis and Grim Jim. That's everything for today. Currently smoking. Ben Wade, Canadian, plus Image Latakia.